Deep in the Colorado Rockies, where winter temperatures drop to 30 below and the nearest road is 40 miles away, a 12-year-old boy named Samuel was left to die. His father, overwhelmed by grief and financial ruin, drove him to the most remote peak he could find and simply walked away. What happened next would challenge everything we think we know about human resilience and the will to survive. For 120 days, Samuel lived completely alone in some of the harshest terrain on Earth. He had no survival training, no equipment, and no hope of rescue. Yet somehow, he not only survived but thrived. When search teams finally found him, what they discovered, hidden in a grove of ancient pines, left them speechless. But what was inside that makeshift cabin that shocked, experienced wilderness experts and made headlines around the world? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drive up the mountain had taken 3 hours, winding through increasingly narrow roads until the pavement gave way to gravel, then dirt, then barely a trail at all. Samuel pressed his face against the passenger window, watching the world grow wilder with each passing mile. Pine trees towered overhead, their branches heavy with snow that hadn't melted since the first storm in October. His father, David, gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles. The man who had once taught Samuel to tie his shoes and ride a bicycle now sat in silence, his weathered face carved with lines that hadn't been there 6 months ago. The leather wallet in his jacket pocket felt heavy against his chest, containing the last photo of them as a complete family. Sarah's smile looked out from behind the plastic window, frozen in a moment when their world still made sense. "Dad, where are we going?" Samuel asked for the 3rd time, his breath fogging the cold glass. David's jaw tightened. He couldn't meet his son's eyes in the rearview mirror. "Just a place I know, somewhere quiet." The truck lurched to a stop at what could hardly be called a trailhead. A weathered wooden sign, barely legible, marked some forgotten hiking path that disappeared into the wilderness. Snow began falling in thick, lazy flakes that meant business, the kind of snow that would pile up fast and stay for months. Samuel climbed out of the truck, his size 8 hiking boots crunching on the frozen ground. The boots were new, bought just last week when David still thought he might take his son camping, might try to rebuild what cancer had torn apart. Now they felt like a cruel joke. "We hiking, Dad?" Samuel's voice carried a note of hope. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was when they would finally talk about Mom, about the empty house, about why Dad hadn't spoken more than 10 words a day since the funeral. David walked around to the back of the truck and pulled out a small backpack. Inside were a few energy bars, a water bottle, and the emergency blanket Sarah had insisted they keep in the vehicle. Always practical, his Sarah. Always thinking ahead. She would never have forgiven him for what he was about to do. The financial papers in the glove compartment told a story David couldn't bear to read anymore. Medical bills that had consumed their savings, the house they would lose next month, the insurance company's final denial letter. Samuel deserved better than watching his father fall apart piece by piece. He deserved a clean ending, not this slow decay. "Samuel," David's voice cracked as he handed over the backpack, "I need you to understand something. Your mother and I, we loved you more than life itself. We still do." The boy looked up with those clear blue eyes that were so much like Sarah's. Trusting, innocent, believing that adults had answers, that fathers could fix anything. "I know, Dad. I love you too." David knelt down and pulled his son into a fierce hug, memorizing the feel of those small arms around his neck, the smell of his hair, the weight of him. This would be the last time. He had to make it count. "I want you to walk up that trail," David said, pointing toward the path that led into the vast wilderness. "Just keep walking until you find a good place to rest. I'll be right behind you." Samuel shouldered the pack, excited now. Finally, an adventure with Dad. Finally, something that felt normal. David watched his son disappear around the first bend in the trail, that familiar bounce in his step that came from 12 years of believing the world was essentially good, that people took care of each other, that parents protected their children no matter what. He waited exactly 5 minutes. Then he got back in the truck. The drive down the mountain felt like descending into hell. Every mile marker was another step away from the boy who had called him Dad, who had trusted him completely, who was now walking deeper into wilderness that would claim him before the week was out. David told himself it was mercy. Better this than watching poverty slowly kill them both. Better than Samuel seeing his father lose the house, lose his job, lose his mind. Better than explaining why there was no money for food, no heat, no future. The leather wallet seemed to burn against his chest. Sarah's photo accused him with every heartbeat, but it was done now. Samuel would think his father was just taking his time, maybe gathering firewood or setting up camp. By the time the boy realized the truth, hypothermia would be setting in. Quick and clean, no drawn-out suffering, no watching his son learn that the world could be cruel beyond imagination. The truck reached the main road as darkness fell. David drove straight to the nearest bar and ordered whiskey. He would drink until he couldn't remember the look of trust in those blue eyes, until he couldn't hear the echo of that young voice saying, "I love you too." Behind him, 40 miles up the mountain, Samuel was still walking. Asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 2, end quote, the abandonment asterisk asterisk. Samuel walked for 2 hours before he realized something was wrong. The trail had grown fainter with each step, until he was following nothing more than deer paths through the underbrush. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that caught in his eyelashes and melted against his cheeks. "Dad," he called out, his voice swallowed by the dense forest. "Dad, where are you?" He stopped and listened. Nothing but the whisper of snow through pine branches and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. The silence felt different from any quiet he had ever known. This wasn't the comfortable quiet of a library or his bedroom at night. This was the vast, indifferent silence of a world that didn't care if he lived or died. Panic started as a flutter in his chest, then spread through his body like ice water. Samuel turned around and began retracing his steps, but the falling snow had already covered his tracks. Every tree looked the same. Every rock formation seemed familiar yet foreign. "Dad!" he screamed, his voice cracking with fear. "Dad, please!" The forest absorbed his cries without echo. Samuel stood in the growing dusk, breathing hard, his heart hammering against his ribs. The reality began to settle over him like the snow itself, cold and inescapable. His father wasn't coming. His father wasn't anywhere nearby. The first night nearly killed him. Samuel huddled against the trunk of a massive pine tree, pulling his jacket tight around his body and trying to stay awake. He had heard somewhere that you weren't supposed to sleep in the cold, that people froze to death in their sleep. So he sat there, shivering violently, watching his breath turn to steam in the frigid air. By morning, he was delirious with cold and exhaustion. His fingers had gone numb inside his gloves, and his feet felt like blocks of ice inside the new hiking boots. But he was alive. Somehow, impossibly, he was alive. The water bottle in his pack had frozen solid during the night. Samuel held it against his chest, waiting for his body heat to melt the ice. It took an hour before he could drink, and the cold water made his teeth ache, but it was liquid, and his body craved it desperately. Food was the next problem. The energy bars in his pack would last maybe 2 days if he was careful. After that, he would have to find something else or starve. Samuel had never been hunting, had never even been camping without a cooler full of sandwiches and juice boxes. But hunger was a powerful teacher. On the second day, he noticed animal tracks in the snow. Rabbit prints, small and delicate, leading toward a grove of aspen trees. Where there were rabbits, there might be other things to eat. Plants, maybe, roots. Samuel followed the tracks, moving slowly and quietly the way he had seen hunters do in movies. The rabbits led him to a small clearing where the snow was thinner, revealing patches of brown grass and scattered acorns. He gathered the acorns carefully, remembering something from a nature documentary about Native Americans grinding them into flour. The acorns were bitter and hard to chew, but they were food, real food that would keep him alive another day. Water was easier. A small stream ran through the valley, hidden under a thin layer of ice that he could break with a rock. The water was so cold it made his head ache, but it was clean and clear. Samuel knelt by the stream and drank deeply, grateful beyond words for this simple gift. On the third day, he found the soda can. Someone had dropped it years ago, and weather had reduced it to fragments of aluminum scattered among the fallen leaves. Samuel picked up a piece about the size of his thumb, studying its sharp edges and curved shape. His grandfather had been a fisherman. Samuel remembered sitting on the dock behind Grandpa's house, watching the old man tie flies and talk about reading the water. "Fish are like people," Grandpa used to say. "They want something shiny, something that catches their eye." Samuel worked for hours, using a sharp stone to carefully shape the aluminum fragment. He bent it into a crude hook, filed the point against a rough rock until it was sharp enough to pierce skin. It wasn't much to look at, but it might catch a fish. It might keep him alive. The fishing line was harder. Samuel pulled threads from his jacket, braiding them together until he had something that might hold a small trout. He tied the makeshift hook to the line and attached the other end to a straight branch he had stripped of bark. Standing by the stream in the growing twilight, Samuel cast his primitive fishing line into the dark water. He had no bait except for small pieces of acorn, but maybe that would be enough. Maybe the fish were as hungry as he was. The hook disappeared beneath the surface, and Samuel held his breath, waiting for a miracle. The fish came on the fourth morning, a small brook trout that fought harder than anything Samuel had ever imagined. When he finally pulled it from the stream, gasping and silver in the dawn light, he felt something shift inside his chest. Not just relief, but a kind of quiet pride he had never experienced before. He cleaned the fish with a sharp piece of flint, the way he had seen his grandfather do it years ago. The meat was sweet and clean, tasting of mountain water and wild places. Samuel ate every scrap, even sucking the bones clean, his body desperate for protein after days of acorns and stream water. With food in his belly and warmth from a small fire he had finally managed to coax from dry pine needles, Samuel began to see the mountain differently. Instead of an endless maze of trees and rocks, he started to notice patterns. The way water flowed downhill toward the main creek, the places where wind had carved natural shelters in the rock faces, the southern slopes where snow melted first, revealing patches of wild onions and late berries. He made his first map on a piece of birch bark, using charcoal from his fire to mark important landmarks. The big stream where he caught fish, the grove of oak trees where acorns were thickest, the rocky outcrop that gave him a view of the entire valley, the cave where he had sheltered during a particularly brutal windstorm. Each day, Samuel expanded his territory a little further. He learned to read the weather by watching cloud formations and feeling changes in air pressure. When his joints ached, it meant snow was coming. When the wind shifted to blow from the north, he knew to find shelter quickly. The animals became his teachers. He watched how squirrels stored food for winter, creating multiple caches in case one was discovered by predators. He observed where deer bedded down during storms, always in spots protected from wind, but with multiple escape routes. Ravens showed him where carrion lay hidden, and their cries warned him when larger predators were nearby. Samuel's hands grew skilled at tasks he had never attempted before. He learned to weave grass into cordage strong enough to hold a fish trap. He discovered which rocks would hold an edge when napped into tools, and which would crumble uselessly. He found that pine pitch mixed with charcoal made a waterproof coating for his makeshift containers. The birch bark map grew more detailed each day. Samuel marked the places where certain plants grew, the seasonal patterns of animal movement, the locations of the deepest pools in the stream where the largest trout hid. He noted which slopes caught the morning sun and which remained in shadow until afternoon. Weather patterns became as readable as a book. 3 days of clear skies meant a storm was building. Ice forming on the stream edges at night told him winter was settling in for good. The way smoke from his fire behaved warned him of wind changes hours before they arrived. Samuel discovered he had a natural sense for navigation that surprised him. Even in dense forest, he could maintain his direction by reading the subtle signs of moss growth, the lean of trees shaped by prevailing winds, the way snow accumulated differently on north-facing and south-facing slopes. His body adapted to the mountain routine. He woke at dawn without an alarm, his internal clock synchronized to the rhythm of daylight and darkness. His muscles hardened from constant climbing and carrying. His hearing grew sharp enough to distinguish between the footsteps of different animals moving through the underbrush. The most important discovery came during his second week alone. While following a game trail toward higher ground, Samuel stumbled upon a grove of ancient pine trees, unlike anything he had seen before. These giants were easily 300 years old, their massive trunks creating a natural cathedral in the forest. But what caught his attention wasn't their size or age, it was their arrangement. The trees formed a rough circle around a small clearing, perfectly protected from wind and weather. A tiny spring bubbled up from the rocks at the center, feeding a pool of clear water that never froze completely. Samuel stood in the grove for a long time, feeling something he couldn't name. This place felt different from the rest of the mountain. Safe, hidden, like a secret the forest had kept for centuries, waiting for someone who truly needed sanctuary. He added the grove to his birch bark map with special care, marking it with a double circle. Something told him this place would be important. Something told him he would be back. As November deepened and the snow began to stay on the ground instead of melting each afternoon, Samuel felt his understanding of the mountain reaching a new level. He was no longer just surviving day to day. He was learning to live here, to be part of this wild place instead of fighting against it. The mountain was teaching him, and finally, he was ready to listen. The storm came without warning on a Tuesday morning in late November. Samuel had grown confident in reading weather signs, but this one caught him completely off guard. He woke to find his small lean-to shelter buried under 6 inches of fresh snow, with more falling so heavily he could barely see 10 feet in any direction. The wind hit like a living thing, howling through the trees with a ferocity that made his bones ache. This wasn't the gentle snowfall he had grown accustomed to. This was the kind of storm that killed people, the kind that turned mountains into graveyards. Samuel's carefully constructed lean-to, which had seemed so sturdy just hours before, began to buckle under the weight of accumulating snow. Pine boughs that had provided adequate shelter for weeks now seemed flimsy as paper against the driving wind. Ice formed on every surface, making everything slippery and treacherous. By noon, the temperature had dropped so far that Samuel's breath came in great clouds of steam that froze instantly on his jacket. His water bottle turned to solid ice, despite being tucked inside his clothing. The stream where he caught fish began to freeze over, cutting off his primary source of both water and food. The wind found every gap in his shelter, every weakness in his clothing. It stripped heat from his body faster than he could generate it, even huddled next to his small fire. The flames themselves struggled against the gusts, flickering dangerously close to extinction despite his best efforts to shield them. Samuel tried to reinforce his lean-to with more branches, but the storm made it impossible to work effectively. Snow blinded him, wind knocked him off balance, and ice made every surface treacherous. His hands grew numb inside his gloves, making it difficult to tie knots or grip tools properly. As afternoon faded to evening, Samuel realized with growing terror that his shelter wasn't going to survive the night. Already, one corner had collapsed under the snow load, and the rest of the structure groaned ominously with each gust of wind. If the lean-to failed completely, he would be exposed to the full fury of the storm. The cold was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It crept through his clothing like a living thing, finding its way to his core despite every layer he wore. His feet went numb first, then his fingers, then a creeping numbness that seemed to spread up his arms and legs toward his heart. Samuel knew about hypothermia from school health classes. He knew that when you stopped shivering, when you started feeling warm instead of cold, when you began to feel drowsy and confused, those were the signs that your body was shutting down. He wasn't there yet, but he could feel himself sliding toward that edge. The storm raged through the night, growing stronger instead of weaker. Samuel huddled in his failing shelter, feeding precious fuel to a fire that barely kept him alive. He burned everything he could find. Dry wood he had carefully saved, pine needles, even pages from a small notebook he had been using to record his observations. Around midnight, disaster struck. A massive gust of wind caught the remaining wall of his lean-to and ripped it away like tissue paper. Snow immediately began filling the space where Samuel had been sleeping, driven by a wind that felt like frozen knives against his skin. He was now completely exposed to the storm, with nothing but a dying fire between him and death. The cold hit him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and making his heart race with panic. This was it. This was how it would end. But as Samuel crouched by his fire, snow swirling around him in the darkness, something unexpected happened. Instead of despair, he felt a strange clarity wash over him. The storm was going to kill him if he stayed here, but he didn't have to stay here. The grove, the secret place he had discovered weeks ago, with its circle of ancient pines and protected clearing. It was less than a mile away, but it might as well have been on the moon in weather like this. Still, it was his only chance. Samuel gathered what he could carry, his knife, his fire-starting materials, and a torn piece of emergency blanket that had somehow stayed dry. The silver material caught what little light there was, a tiny beacon of hope in the storm. He left the fire burning and walked into the teeth of the blizzard, following instincts and memory toward the grove that might save his life. The journey through the storm was a nightmare of wind and cold and disorientation, but Samuel pressed on, driven by a will to survive that he hadn't known he possessed. When he finally stumbled into the grove 3 hours later, more dead than alive, he fell to his knees in the protected clearing and wept with relief. The ancient pines had turned the howling storm into a whisper. Here, finally, was sanctuary. Here, he would build something that would last. The grove saved Samuel's life that first night, but survival wasn't enough anymore. As he crouched in the protected clearing, watching the storm rage harmlessly above the canopy of ancient pines, he understood that winter was just beginning. He needed more than temporary shelter. He needed a home. The morning after the blizzard revealed a transformed landscape. 3 feet of new snow had buried his old camping spot completely, erasing weeks of careful preparation as if it had never existed. But here in the grove, only a thin layer of snow had made it through the dense canopy. The ancient trees had created a natural shelter that put his crude lean-to to shame. Samuel spent the first day simply observing. He walked the perimeter of the grove, studying how the trees were positioned, why this spot stayed so much warmer and drier than the surrounding forest. The pines formed an almost perfect circle, their massive trunks spaced just far enough apart to allow air circulation but close enough to block wind and weather. The spring at the center of the clearing was the key to everything. It bubbled up from deep underground, staying liquid even when the temperature dropped well below freezing. The water was clean and sweet, better than anything that came from a tap. More importantly, it would never run dry or freeze solid, giving him a reliable water source through the worst winter weather. Samuel began collecting stones. Not just any stones, but specific ones, flat pieces that would stack evenly. Cornerstones with natural angles that would lock together. Foundation stones large enough to support significant weight. He arranged them carefully around the clearing, studying how they fit together, imagining the structure they would support. The work required patience he had never possessed before. Each stone had to be perfect for its intended purpose. Samuel would examine dozens of candidates before finding one that met his standards. Too soft, and it would crumble under pressure. Too round, and it wouldn't stack properly. Too small, and it wouldn't provide adequate support. He developed a system for testing stone quality. A sharp rap with his knife handle would reveal cracks or soft spots. The sound told him everything he needed to know about density and durability. Good stone rang like a bell. Poor stone made a dull thud that warned of hidden flaws. The foundation design emerged slowly in Samuel's mind. He paced off the dimensions, marking corners with carefully selected stones. 12 feet by 8 feet would give him enough space to live comfortably while staying small enough to heat efficiently. The door would face south to catch maximum sunlight. Windows would go on the east and west walls to provide cross-ventilation in summer. Samuel sketched his plans on pieces of birch bark, working out problems before he encountered them in construction. How would he join the walls at the corners? What angle should the roof have to shed snow effectively? How could he create a chimney that would draw properly without letting heat escape? The trees themselves would provide most of his building material. Samuel identified dead pines of the right diameter, already seasoned and ready to use. He marked them with charcoal, planning the order in which he would harvest them. Smaller trees for the upper courses, larger ones for the foundation logs. Toolmaking became an obsession. Samuel needed implements that would last through months of heavy construction work. He spent days crafting a proper felling axe from a piece of steel he had found near an old logging camp. The handle was carved from seasoned hickory, shaped to fit his hands perfectly. The blade was sharp enough to shave with. Chinking material was another challenge. The gaps between logs would need to be sealed against wind and weather, but with what? Samuel experimented with different mixtures of clay, moss, and pine pitch. He found that red clay from the streambank, mixed with dried moss and a small amount of pine resin, created a compound that dried hard as cement but remained flexible enough not to crack in extreme cold. The roof design required the most careful thought. Samuel remembered his grandfather talking about load distribution and snow loads. A roof that was too flat would collapse under heavy snow, too steep, and wind would try to tear it off. He settled on a pitch that would shed snow naturally while providing maximum interior space. Samuel arranged his foundation stones in a precise rectangle, checking and rechecking the measurements and angles. Each stone was positioned with mathematical precision, creating a level base that would support the entire structure. The corners were especially critical, requiring stones that would lock together and distribute weight evenly. As December approached and the snow deepened around the grove, Samuel felt ready to begin construction. His materials were gathered, his tools were sharp, and his plan was solid. The foundation stones lay waiting, perfectly arranged and absolutely level. Tomorrow, he would begin building his home. The first log went down on a crisp December morning when the air was so cold it burned Samuel's lungs with each breath. He had chosen a massive pine, dead for several years but still sound, with bark that peeled away to reveal straight-grained wood underneath. The log was nearly 14 feet long and thick as his waist, heavy enough that moving it required every technique he had learned about leverage and momentum. Samuel had fashioned a simple but effective logging tool from a fallen branch and a piece of steel cable he had scavenged from an old fence line. The cable wrapped around the log gave him the grip he needed to roll it into position, while the branch served as a lever to lift and adjust. It took him most of the morning to move that first log, the 100 yards from where it had fallen to his foundation stones. Positioning the log precisely on the stone foundation required patience that would have been impossible for him just months ago. The weight had to be distributed evenly, with no gaps or wobbles that would compromise the entire structure. Samuel used smaller stones as shims, adjusting and readjusting until the log sat perfectly level and secure. The second log was where the real challenge began. It had to fit against the first log with mathematical precision, creating a corner joint that would hold the entire wall system together. Samuel had studied the problem for weeks, examining old barns and cabins in his memory, trying to understand how pioneer builders had solved the same challenge with nothing but hand tools. The solution came to him while watching how fallen trees naturally locked together after a windstorm. The secret was the notch, a carefully carved depression that would cradle the perpendicular log and distribute its weight evenly. But the notch had to be perfect. Too shallow, and the logs would slide apart. Too deep, and the wood would be weakened past the point of structural integrity. Samuel spent 3 hours carving his first corner notch, working with a combination of axe and knife, checking his progress constantly with a small level he had improvised from a water-filled piece of hollow reed. The wood curled away in long, satisfying shavings that smelled of pine sap and winter air. When he finally lowered the second log into place, it fit like the last piece of a puzzle. The joint was so tight that no light showed through the connection, so precisely cut that the logs seemed to have grown together naturally. Samuel stepped back and looked at his corner joint with a satisfaction deeper than anything he had ever felt. The framework grew log by log, each one requiring the same careful attention to detail. Samuel developed a rhythm to the work that consumed entire days without fatigue. Mark the notch location. Score the wood with his knife, rough out the shape with his axe, fine-tune the fit with careful paring cuts, test the fit, adjust, test again. His hands grew skilled in ways that surprised him. He could feel the grain of the wood through his tools, sensing exactly where to cut and how much pressure to apply. His eyes learned to see tiny variations in angle and level that would have been invisible to him before. His body developed the muscle memory of precise tool work, hands moving almost independently of conscious thought. The logs themselves taught him as much as any human instructor could have. Each piece of wood had its own personality, its own grain patterns and stress points and natural curves. Samuel learned to work with these characteristics instead of fighting them, choosing logs for specific positions based on their individual strengths. Corner joints became his specialty. Each one was slightly different, adapted to the specific logs being joined, but all of them shared the same underlying principle of perfect fit and maximum strength. Samuel would spend an entire afternoon on a single joint, carving and testing and adjusting until it was absolutely right. By the end of the first week, Samuel had 4 courses of logs in place, creating walls nearly 3 feet high. The structure was already beginning to feel substantial, heavy enough that wind couldn't budge it, solid enough to inspire confidence. He could see the shape of his future home emerging from the careful arrangement of wood and stone. The work changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. His shoulders broadened from the constant lifting and positioning of heavy logs. His hands grew calloused and strong, capable of gripping tools for hours without fatigue. His back developed the deep muscles that came from lifting and carrying and bending in precise, controlled movements. But the changes went deeper than muscle and bone. Samuel found himself thinking in 3 dimensions, visualizing how each log would affect the overall structure, planning moves several steps ahead like a chess master. He began to understand weight distribution and load-bearing and structural integrity, not as abstract concepts, but as physical realities he could feel in his hands. The corner joint he completed that evening was his masterpiece so far, a perfect marriage of 2 massive logs that locked together with mathematical precision. When he tapped it with his axe handle, the entire wall rang like a bell, solid and true, and built to last for generations. As the walls of Samuel's cabin reached shoulder height, the complexity of the construction multiplied exponentially. What had been straightforward work at ground level now required careful planning for windows, door openings, and the intricate problem of weatherproofing. Each log had to be selected not just for structural integrity, but for how it would shed water and resist the penetrating cold of high-altitude winter. The door opening proved to be Samuel's first major engineering challenge. Simply leaving a gap between logs wasn't enough. The opening needed proper headers to distribute the weight of the logs above, and the vertical edges required careful finishing to create a weather-tight seal. Samuel studied the problem for days before attempting his first cut. He marked the door location with precise measurements, using a string line to ensure the opening would be perfectly plumb. The cuts had to be exact, too wide, and the structure would be weakened. Too narrow, and he would have trouble getting his growing collection of tools and supplies in and out of the cabin. The sawing was methodical work that tested every muscle in his body. Samuel had crafted a bow saw from a curved piece of ash wood and a blade he had painstakingly filed from a piece of scrap steel. Each stroke had to be perfectly aligned to avoid binding in the cut. Green pine was tough and sticky with sap, fighting every inch of progress. When the door opening was finally complete, Samuel stepped back to admire his work. The edges were clean and square, cut with a precision that would have impressed a professional carpenter. More importantly, the structure remained solid and true, with no sagging or shifting despite the large opening in the wall. Windows required even more sophisticated planning. Samuel had found several pieces of clear glass in the ruins of an old Forest Service cabin, each piece roughly 12 inches square. They weren't perfect, with bubbles and minor scratches, but they would admit light while keeping out wind and weather. Creating window frames from scratch pushed Samuel's woodworking skills to new levels. He needed rabbeted joints to hold the glass securely, precise measurements to ensure a tight fit, and careful attention to drainage so water wouldn't pool and freeze. Each frame was a miniature work of art, assembled with wooden pegs and sealed with pine pitch. The chinking mixture had evolved through dozens of experiments. Samuel discovered that red clay from the creek bank, when mixed with dried moss and pine resin in exact proportions, created a compound that remained flexible in extreme cold while providing an airtight seal. The trick was getting the consistency right. Too wet, and it would shrink as it dried, leaving gaps. Too dry, and it wouldn't adhere properly to the logs. Applying the chinking was meditative work that consumed entire afternoons. Samuel worked from the inside of the cabin, pressing the mixture into every gap with his fingers, smoothing it until the surface was perfectly even. The clay had to be worked while it was still plastic, shaped and molded to follow the contours of the logs. He found that different weather conditions required different mixing ratios. On dry days, he added more water to keep the clay workable longer. When humidity was high, he reduced the moisture content to prevent cracking as the mixture cured. Each batch was mixed in a wooden bowl he had carved specifically for the purpose, the interior worn smooth by countless stirrings. The cabin walls reached 6 feet in height by mid-December, creating an enclosed space that already felt like shelter. Samuel could stand inside and look up at the sky through the gap where his roof would eventually go, but the walls blocked wind and provided a sense of enclosure that his previous shelters had never achieved. Temperature control became noticeable as the walls grew higher. Even without a roof, the interior of the cabin stayed several degrees warmer than the outside air. Samuel began spending his evenings inside, working on interior projects by the light of a small fire built in what would eventually become his fireplace. The fireplace itself was a major undertaking that required skills Samuel didn't know he possessed. He built it from flat stones carefully selected for their heat resistance, using clay mortar to bind them together. The firebox had to be the right size to provide adequate heat without smoking up the interior. The throat needed precise dimensions to create proper draft. Samuel studied smoke patterns obsessively, watching how his test fires behaved under different wind conditions. He adjusted the firebox design repeatedly, raising and lowering the back wall, changing the angle of the throat, experimenting with different chimney heights until he achieved a clean, steady burn. The interior walls required finishing work that went far beyond basic construction. Samuel smoothed the log surfaces with improvised planes, sealed joints with carefully applied chinking, and began planning the layout of his living space. Where would he sleep? Where would he store food and tools? How could he maximize the efficiency of the small space? By Christmas week, Samuel's cabin had walls 7 feet high and a completed fireplace that drew smoke cleanly up and out of the structure. The interior felt spacious and warm, a genuine sanctuary against the mountain winter that raged outside the ancient pine grove. Samuel discovered his gift on a quiet January afternoon while working on the cabin's interior door. What had started as a simple functional project somehow transformed into something extraordinary under his hands. The wood seemed to respond to his touch, revealing possibilities he had never imagined. He had been carving the door handle from a piece of seasoned oak, intending nothing more than a basic grip that would serve its purpose. But as his knife moved through the wood, following the grain and working around knots, Samuel found himself seeing shapes within the timber that begged to be released. The handle evolved into the head of a mountain lion, its features emerging with a clarity that startled him. The eyes held intelligence and wildness, the muzzle showed power and grace, the ears were alert and perfectly proportioned. Samuel had never attempted anything like this before, yet his hands seemed to know exactly what to do. The discovery unlocked memories he had forgotten completely. His grandfather's workshop, filled with the smell of wood shavings and linseed oil, patient hands guiding his small fingers as they learned to feel the grain, to understand how wood wanted to be cut. Hours spent watching the old man coax impossible beauty from rough timber, creating furniture that seemed to breathe with life. "Wood has its own mind, Samuel," his grandfather had said, his voice carrying across the years like an echo. "Your job isn't to force it into what you want. Your job is to listen to what it wants to become." Samuel set down his knife and looked around the cabin with new eyes. Everywhere, he saw opportunities for beauty that went far beyond mere function. The window frames could be more than simple rectangles. The interior walls could showcase the natural character of the wood instead of hiding it. Even practical items like shelves and storage boxes could be works of art. He started small, with decorative elements that wouldn't compromise the cabin's structural integrity. A carved rosette where two roof beams met. Gentle curves added to the edges of his windowsills. Small animals emerging from knots and natural imperfections in the log walls. But Samuel's true revelation came when he began working on the mantelpiece above his fireplace. The piece of wood he had selected was a massive oak burl, its grain twisted into impossible spirals by years of irregular growth. Most builders would have dismissed it as unusable, too difficult to work with conventional tools and techniques. Samuel saw something different. Within the chaotic swirls of grain, he perceived the shape of an eagle in flight, its wings spread wide, its head turned skyward with fierce pride. The image was so clear in his mind that he could hardly believe it had been hidden in the wood all along. Carving the eagle required skills he shouldn't have possessed. The work demanded an understanding of anatomy, proportion, and artistic composition that typically took years to develop. Yet Samuel's hands moved with confidence, each cut revealing more of the majestic bird that had been waiting within the burl. The eagle's feathers were individually defined, each one carved with attention to detail that bordered on obsession. The powerful talons gripped a mountain peak, symbolizing Samuel's own grip on survival and mastery. The beak was sharp and proud, the eyes held wisdom and wildness in equal measure. Working on the eagle consumed Samuel for weeks. He would lose track of time, carving by firelight long into the night, driven by a creative fever he had never experienced before. The work was meditative and energizing at the same time, requiring total concentration while somehow refreshing his spirit. As the carving neared completion, Samuel began to understand that this was more than artistic expression. This was memory given form, a connection to his grandfather that transcended death and abandonment. Every technique his hands remembered, every instinct for reading wood grain, was a gift passed down through generations. The finished eagle was breathtaking in its beauty and power. The wood seemed to glow in the firelight, the carved feathers creating patterns of light and shadow that made the bird appear almost alive. Samuel mounted it above his fireplace, where it dominated the entire cabin interior, a testament to the artistic soul he hadn't known he possessed. But the eagle was only the beginning. Samuel's hands had remembered skills that went far beyond simple carving. He found himself understanding complex joinery techniques, visualizing furniture designs that combined function with beauty, seeing possibilities in every piece of wood he encountered. The cabin's interior began to transform from a simple survival shelter into something approaching a work of art. Every surface showed evidence of Samuel's growing mastery. Every detail reflected his developing aesthetic sense. This wasn't just a place to survive the winter. This was becoming a home worthy of the mountain sanctuary that surrounded it. Samuel stepped back from his completed eagle and felt something shift deep in his chest. He wasn't just a lost boy surviving in the wilderness anymore. He was an artist, a craftsman, a creator of beauty in a world that could be harsh and unforgiving. His grandfather's spirit lived on in every cut, every curve, every moment of inspiration that flowed through his increasingly skilled hands. With the cabin's structure complete and his artistic abilities awakened, Samuel turned his attention to creating a living space that would rival any home in the civilized world. The interior needed furniture, storage, and comfort systems that would serve him through the remainder of winter and beyond. His first major project was a bed frame that would lift him off the cold floor and provide proper support for restful sleep. Samuel selected straight-grained pine logs and began the painstaking process of creating mortise and tenon joints that would hold together without a single nail or screw. Each joint had to be cut by hand with perfect precision, the tenon fitting snugly into its corresponding mortise. The bed frame took shape over several days, each piece carefully measured and fitted before being locked into place. Samuel wove a sleeping surface from strips of hide he had cured from deer he had trapped, creating a comfortable platform that would support his weight while allowing air circulation. The headboard received carved decorations, woodland scenes that seemed to flow naturally from the wood grain. Storage was the next challenge. Samuel built a series of shelves and cabinets along the cabin walls, each one designed to hold specific items. Food storage required containers that would keep mice and other small animals out while maintaining proper ventilation. Tool storage needed easy access but secure retention. Clothing storage had to protect fabric from moisture and insects. Samuel discovered he had an intuitive understanding of furniture, proportions, and ergonomics. His chairs were exactly the right height for comfort, his work table precisely positioned to take advantage of natural light from the windows. Every piece seemed to fit the space perfectly, as if the cabin had been designed around the furniture rather than the other way around. The dining table became his masterpiece of functional art. Cut from a single massive pine slab, it required weeks of patient work to achieve a surface smooth enough to showcase the wood's natural beauty. Samuel used techniques his grandfather's hands remembered, planing the surface with tools he had crafted himself, sanding with progressively finer grades of stone until the wood felt like silk. The table's legs were carved from solid oak, each one shaped like a twisted tree trunk, complete with bark texture and realistic proportions. When assembled, the table appeared to be growing directly from the cabin floor, a living tree that had somehow transformed into furniture while retaining its natural character. Samuel's weaving skills developed with remarkable speed. He gathered materials from the mountain environment: willow shoots for basketry, pine needles for waterproof containers, grass fibers for rope and cordage. His hands learned to manipulate these materials with increasing sophistication, creating containers and textiles that rivaled professional craftsmanship. The floor covering was his greatest weaving challenge. Samuel wanted something that would insulate against cold while providing comfort underfoot. He experimented with different materials and patterns before settling on a technique that combined woven grass with deer hide strips, creating a textile that was both beautiful and practical. Working on the mat consumed entire evenings by firelight. Samuel developed a meditative rhythm to the weaving, his hands moving automatically while his mind planned future projects. The pattern that emerged was complex and sophisticated, featuring geometric designs that seemed to echo the mountain landscape visible through his windows. Each element of the cabin's interior reflected Samuel's growing understanding of both function and beauty. His cooking utensils were carved from different woods, chosen for their specific properties. Hardwood for items that needed to resist wear, softwood for delicate work, aromatic cedar for food storage containers that would repel insects naturally. The cabin's lighting system showed his practical ingenuity. Samuel created reflectors from pieces of polished metal, positioned to amplify and direct firelight throughout the interior. Oil lamps burned fish oil or rendered animal fat, providing steady illumination for detailed work during the short winter days. Climate control became increasingly sophisticated as Samuel learned to manage the cabin's thermal environment. Adjustable vents allowed him to control air circulation, directing warm air where it was needed while preventing heat loss. Thermal mass from his stone fireplace stored heat during the day and released it gradually through the night. Samuel's personal items received the same careful attention as functional furniture. His clothing was stored in carved chests that protected fabric while adding beauty to the interior. His tools were displayed on custom-made racks that kept them organized and easily accessible. Even his dishes and eating utensils were crafted works of art. The transformation of the cabin's interior reflected Samuel's own transformation from desperate survivor to master craftsman. Every surface showed evidence of skill and artistic vision. Every functional element demonstrated understanding of materials and construction techniques that most adults never achieved. By February, Samuel's cabin had become something unprecedented in the wilderness. It was a home that combined the comfort and sophistication of civilization with the natural beauty and harmony of mountain life. The woven mat beneath his feet was soft and warm. The carved furniture around him was both beautiful and functional, and the artistic details throughout the space reflected a level of craftsmanship that defied explanation. February brought the deepest cold Samuel had ever experienced. Temperatures plunged to 40 below zero, turning the mountain into a crystalline fortress where every breath created clouds of ice crystals and exposed skin would freeze in minutes. This was the test that would prove whether his preparations had been adequate or merely hopeful. The preserved food cache that lined his cabin walls represented months of careful planning and execution. Samuel had learned to smoke meat over carefully controlled fires, creating jerky that would last indefinitely without spoilage. Fish caught through holes in the ice were packed in snow and stored in underground pits that stayed consistently frozen. Vegetables gathered in autumn were dried and stored in sealed containers that protected them from moisture and rodents. His food preservation techniques had evolved through trial and error into sophisticated systems that rivaled anything used by professional hunters and trappers. Samuel discovered that different meats required different curing methods. Venison needed longer smoking times than fish. Rabbit was best preserved by rendering the fat and storing the meat in its own grease. Wild birds could be preserved whole by careful salting and air drying. The underground root cellar had been one of his most ambitious projects, requiring him to excavate beneath the cabin floor without compromising the foundation. The space stayed consistently cool but never froze completely, perfect for storing root vegetables and fermented foods. Samuel had learned to make sauerkraut from wild cabbage, creating a source of vitamins that would prevent scurvy during the long winter months. Hunting in deep winter required skills and patience that pushed Samuel to his absolute limits. Animals were scarce and wary, their survival instincts sharpened by the harsh conditions. Samuel's traps had to be positioned with perfect precision, accounting for animal behavior patterns that changed with the weather and food availability. His most successful innovation was a deadfall trap system that could function reliably even in extreme cold. The mechanism used carefully balanced rocks and trigger sticks that wouldn't bind or freeze, positioned along game trails that animals continued to use even in the deepest snow. Samuel checked his trap lines every other day, moving silently through the forest on improvised snowshoes that distributed his weight evenly. The snowshoes themselves were masterpieces of practical engineering. Samuel had woven them from willow branches and deer sinew, creating frames that were light enough for long-distance travel but strong enough to support his weight on powder snow. The bindings were designed to release quickly in an emergency, preventing broken bones if he fell into a hidden crevice or stream. Ice fishing became a regular part of Samuel's survival routine, requiring techniques that worked in temperatures that would defeat most equipment. He learned to keep his fishing holes open by covering them with pine boughs and snow, creating insulated spaces that stayed workable even in extreme cold. His hooks were carved from bone and antler, materials that wouldn't become brittle in sub-zero temperatures. The psychological challenges of deep winter isolation were as demanding as the physical ones. Samuel developed routines that kept his mind sharp and his spirits high despite weeks of unchanging cold and limited daylight. He carved intricate puzzles from wood scraps, creating brain teasers that could occupy entire evenings by firelight. Reading the weather became a survival skill that could mean the difference between life and death. Samuel learned to predict temperature drops by watching cloud formations and feeling changes in air pressure. Animal behavior provided early warnings of approaching storms. When ravens gathered in large flocks and deer moved to lower elevations, it meant severe weather was coming within hours. His cabin's heating system had evolved into a sophisticated network of thermal management that maximized efficiency while minimizing fuel consumption. Samuel had learned to bank his fires properly, maintaining enough heat to prevent freezing while conserving precious firewood. Thermal mass from his stone fireplace stored heat during peak burning periods and released it slowly through the night. Ventilation was a constant balancing act between maintaining air quality and preventing heat loss. Samuel had installed adjustable vents that could be fine-tuned for different weather conditions. Too little ventilation led to dangerous carbon monoxide buildup. Too much caused rapid heat loss that could be fatal in extreme cold. The preservation methods extended beyond food to include medicinal plants and materials needed for ongoing projects. Samuel had dried willow bark for pain relief, gathered pine needles for vitamin C, and stockpiled plants that could treat digestive problems or infections. His knowledge of wilderness medicine had grown from desperate necessity into sophisticated understanding. By the end of February, Samuel had not merely survived the deepest winter in decades, he had thrived in conditions that would have defeated experienced mountaineers. His food stores remained adequate, his shelter stayed warm and dry, and his health remained excellent despite months of isolation and harsh weather. The preserved cache that surrounded him represented more than sustenance. It was proof that careful planning, patient execution, and deep understanding of natural systems could overcome even the most challenging circumstances that nature could present. The first helicopter appeared on a clear March morning, its distant rotors creating a sound Samuel hadn't heard in over 100 days. He stood in his cabin doorway, watching the aircraft circle the valley below, knowing that somewhere down there people were looking for him. The search had finally begun. Samuel had been preparing for this moment since the deep winter storms ended. He understood that rescue teams would eventually expand their search to the high country, and when they did, he wanted to be found on his own terms. The signal mirror array he had constructed around the grove represented weeks of careful planning and positioning. Each mirror was strategically placed to catch sunlight from different angles throughout the day, creating a network of reflective surfaces that could be seen from miles away. Samuel had salvaged the mirrors from abandoned campsites and old Forest Service installations, polishing them until they gleamed like silver fire when the sun hit them properly. The main signal mirror was positioned at the highest point, accessible from his cabin, mounted on a carefully engineered pivot system that allowed him to aim reflected sunlight with precision. Samuel had practiced with the device for hours, learning to flash coded signals that any pilot would recognize as human-made rather than natural reflection. But signaling was only part of his preparation. Samuel had also created a clear trail system that would lead rescuers directly to his cabin while showcasing the full extent of his survival achievement. The trail markers were works of art in themselves, carved wooden signs that indicated direction while demonstrating his craftsmanship skills. The approach to his cabin had been designed like a museum exhibit, each element carefully positioned to tell the story of his transformation from abandoned child to master craftsman. Visitors would encounter evidence of his tool-making skills, his construction techniques, his artistic abilities, and his deep understanding of wilderness survival. Samuel felt a complex mix of emotions as he watched the helicopter disappear beyond the ridge. Part of him yearned for human contact after months of solitude, but another part had grown deeply attached to his mountain sanctuary, to the life he had built with his own hands in harmony with the natural world. The cabin around him represented more than shelter. It was proof of human potential, evidence that with determination and creativity, a person could not only survive but thrive in conditions that most would consider impossible. Every carved detail, every perfectly fitted joint, every innovative solution told the story of remarkable adaptation and growth. Samuel spent the afternoon making final preparations for discovery. He organized his tools and projects to display them most effectively, arranged his food stores to demonstrate his preservation techniques, and positioned his carved artwork to showcase his artistic development. The cabin would speak for itself, but he wanted to ensure the story it told was complete and clear. The hardest part was the internal preparation. Samuel had changed profoundly during his time alone on the mountain. The frightened 12-year-old who had been abandoned here no longer existed. In his place was someone older in wisdom, if not in years, someone who had discovered capabilities he never knew he possessed. He wrote letters on pieces of birch bark, messages to his father and to the wider world about what he had learned during his time alone. The writing was therapeutic, helping him process the emotional journey he had traveled alongside the physical one. Forgiveness, he realized, was easier from a position of strength and self-knowledge. The signal mirrors caught afternoon sunlight and sent brilliant flashes across the valley, a beacon that announced his presence to anyone who might be watching. Samuel adjusted the angles carefully, creating a pattern of flashes that would be unmistakable to searchers. 3 long flashes, 3 short, 3 long. The international distress signal that every pilot and rescue worker would recognize. As evening approached, Samuel lit a signal fire on the rocky outcrop above his cabin. The smoke would be visible for miles in the still air, a column rising straight up into the darkening sky. He fed the fire with green pine boughs that created thick, white smoke, easily distinguished from natural forest fires. The night passed quietly, but Samuel sensed that change was coming. Animals seemed more alert, as if they too could feel the approaching disruption to their mountain sanctuary. The ravens called more frequently, and deer moved through the grove in patterns that suggested they were responding to unfamiliar sounds and vibrations. Samuel spent the early morning hours in meditation, sitting by his fire and reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. In a few hours or days, his solitary life would end. People would come, questions would be asked, decisions would be made about his future that were beyond his control. But whatever happened next, no one could take away what he had accomplished here. The cabin would remain as testimony to human resilience and creativity. The skills he had developed would stay with him forever. The confidence he had gained through surviving and thriving in the wilderness had become part of his fundamental identity. Samuel checked his signal mirrors one final time as the sun crested the eastern peaks, sending brilliant flashes of light dancing across the valley below. Today felt different. Today felt like the day they would find him. The rescue team found Samuel's first trail marker at dawn on March 15th, exactly 120 days after his abandonment. Search and rescue coordinator Jake Morrison had been leading mountain rescues for 15 years, but nothing had prepared him for what they discovered that morning. The marker was a carved wooden sign, expertly crafted and weatherproofed, that read, "Follow the trail to find Samuel," in letters that showed remarkable artistic skill. Morrison photographed the sign with his digital camera, documenting what would become the first piece of evidence in a story that would captivate the world. "This wasn't made by a scared kid," Morrison radioed to his team. "This is professional quality work." The trail that followed was unlike anything the experienced rescuers had ever encountered. Instead of random survival debris, they found a carefully planned route marked with increasingly sophisticated signs. Each marker demonstrated growing skill and confidence, leading them higher into terrain that most people would consider impassable. Wildlife photographer Sarah Chen was documenting the rescue for the local newspaper, but as they climbed higher, she realized she was witnessing something far more significant than a routine recovery operation. Her camera captured each trail marker, each sign of impossible competence from someone who should have been a victim rather than a master of his environment. The second day of following Samuel's trail brought them to a series of ingenious survival installations that left the rescue team speechless. A fish trap that showed sophisticated understanding of water dynamics, food storage systems that would have impressed professional wilderness guides, tool caches organized with military precision. "How old did you say this kid was?" asked team member Maria Santos, examining a perfectly crafted bow saw that would have taken a skilled craftsman hours to complete. 12 years old, Morrison replied, his voice carrying disbelief despite the evidence before his eyes. The trail markers grew more artistic as they climbed, each one showcasing skills that seemed impossible for someone so young. Animals carved in lifelike detail, geometric patterns that showed mathematical understanding, messages that revealed not desperation but pride in accomplishment. On the third day, they reached the grove of ancient pines. Morrison's team stood at the edge of the clearing in stunned silence, trying to process what they were seeing. The cabin that rose before them was not a crude survival shelter, but a work of architectural art that belonged in a museum of folk craftsmanship. "Jesus Christ," whispered Chen, her camera clicking rapidly as she documented the impossible structure. "A 12-year-old kid built this?" The cabin's exterior showed craftsmanship that defied explanation, log joints that fit with mathematical precision, windows perfectly aligned and weatherproofed, a roof that shed snow with engineered efficiency, decorative elements that transformed functional construction into genuine art. Samuel emerged from the cabin as if he had been expecting them. The boy they found bore little resemblance to the frightened child in the missing person photos. This was someone who moved with confidence and purpose, whose eyes held wisdom that came from profound self-reliance. "Hello," Samuel said calmly. as if greeting neighbors rather than the first humans he had seen in 4 months. "I've been waiting for you." Morrison activated his digital camera and began documenting everything, understanding instinctively that this discovery would require extensive proof to be believed. The interior of the cabin was even more remarkable than the exterior, filled with furniture and artwork that showcased skills no 12-year-old should possess. "How did you do this?" Morrison asked, his camera recording Samuel's calm, articulate responses to questions about construction techniques, survival methods, and daily routines that revealed sophisticated understanding of wilderness living. Samuel demonstrated his tool-making skills, his food preservation methods, his understanding of weather prediction and thermal management. Each revelation was more astonishing than the last, building a picture of adaptation and growth that challenged everything the rescue team thought they knew about human potential. The carved eagle above the fireplace drew gasps of admiration from the rescuers. The detail was extraordinary, the artistic vision mature and sophisticated. This wasn't the work of a desperate survivor, but of an accomplished artist working in harmony with natural materials. Chen's camera captured Samuel's explanations of his construction techniques, his artistic process, his daily routines that had sustained him through the harshest winter in decades. The footage would become historic documentation of human resilience and creativity under impossible circumstances. "We need to get experts up here," Morrison radioed to base camp. "What this kid has accomplished is going to rewrite survival manuals." Samuel packed his essential belongings with the same methodical care he had brought to every aspect of his mountain life. Tools he had crafted, artwork he had created, journals he had kept on pieces of bark and salvaged paper. These items would serve as additional proof of his remarkable journey. As the rescue team prepared for the journey back to civilization, Morrison's digital camera held hundreds of photographs that would shock wilderness experts and inspire people around the world. The documentation showed not just survival but triumph, not just endurance but artistry, not just a rescue but a revelation about human potential. The rescue footage hit social media within hours of Samuel's discovery, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. The video of a calm, articulate 12-year-old explaining the construction techniques of his handcrafted mountain cabin spread across the internet like wildfire, accumulating millions of views in the first day alone. News outlets around the world picked up the story, but many initially dismissed it as an elaborate hoax. The level of craftsmanship visible in the rescue documentation seemed impossible for someone so young. Expert commentators insisted the footage must have been staged, that no child could possess the skills necessary to create such sophisticated shelter and artwork. But as more evidence emerged, skepticism gave way to amazement. Wilderness survival experts who examined the rescue team's photographs and videos confirmed that everything they saw was genuine. The construction techniques were sound, the tool work was authentic, and the artistic elements showed a progression of skill development that could only come from months of dedicated practice. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a professor of wilderness survival at Colorado State University, was among the first experts to analyze the documentation. What this young man accomplished represents a level of adaptation and skill development that we typically see only in adults with years of training, she told reporters. The fact that he achieved this while completely isolated, with no external support or instruction, is simply unprecedented. Social media exploded with commentary from users around the world. Parents shared the story with their children as inspiration for self-reliance and creativity. Survival enthusiasts analyzed every detail of Samuel's techniques, discussing the innovations and problem-solving approaches he had developed. Artists marveled at the carved eagle and other decorative elements that showed remarkable aesthetic sense. The hashtag #MountainBoyInspiration began trending globally as people shared their own stories of overcoming challenges and discovering hidden talents. Teachers incorporated Samuel's story into lessons about resilience and human potential. Outdoor education programs used his example to encourage students to develop practical skills and self-confidence. Professional craftsmen and woodworkers expressed amazement at the quality of Samuel's joinery and carving work. Master carpenter James Holland examined high-resolution photographs of the cabin's construction and declared it better than most work I see from trained professionals with fully equipped workshops. The viral nature of Samuel's story created a media frenzy that surprised everyone involved. Television networks competed for exclusive interviews. Book publishers offered substantial advances for the rights to tell his story. Documentary filmmakers began planning projects that would explore both his survival techniques and the broader implications of his achievement. International media coverage brought attention from unexpected sources. Indigenous communities in Alaska and Canada reached out to share similar traditional building techniques that Samuel had somehow intuited on his own. Scandinavian craftsmen noted similarities between his work and ancient Nordic construction methods that had been passed down through generations. Child development experts found themselves re-examining assumptions about what young people could accomplish when necessity demanded extreme adaptation. Dr. Michael Chen, who studied resilience in children, observed that Samuel's story challenges our understanding of human potential under extreme circumstances. The story resonated particularly strongly with people who had experienced their own struggles with abandonment, family trauma, or seemingly impossible challenges. Support groups for children of divorce, survivors of abuse, and others dealing with difficult family situations found inspiration in Samuel's transformation from victim to master of his circumstances. Educational institutions began incorporating Samuel's story into curricula, ranging from survival skills to art education. His combination of practical problem-solving with artistic expression provided a unique example of how creativity could flourish even in the harshest circumstances. The viral spread of the footage also sparked debates about modern society's relationship with nature and self-reliance. Environmental advocates pointed to Samuel's story as evidence that humans could live in harmony with wilderness without destroying it. Others used his example to argue for more outdoor education and hands-on learning in schools. Mental health professionals found the story particularly compelling because it demonstrated how creative expression and meaningful work could provide psychological resilience in extreme isolation. Samuel's apparent emotional stability after 4 months alone challenged assumptions about the psychological effects of extended solitude. Religious communities of various denominations found spiritual lessons in Samuel's story, interpreting his journey as evidence of divine protection or the power of faith under adversity. His calm demeanor and mature perspective during rescue interviews suggested a spiritual depth that impressed clergy and believers worldwide. The global reaction to Samuel's story demonstrated how social media could amplify inspirational content across cultural and linguistic boundaries. Translation versions of the rescue footage appeared in dozens of languages, carrying his message of resilience and human potential to audiences around the world. Within a week of his rescue, Samuel had become an international symbol of hope and determination, his story viewed by tens of millions of people who found inspiration in his extraordinary achievement. David Thorne received the phone call at 3:17 inches the morning, nearly 4 months after he had driven away from the mountain and his son. He had been living in a cheap motel outside Denver, drinking himself toward the grave and waiting for news that would confirm what he believed he had done. The voice on the phone shattered his world for the second time. "Mr. Thorne, this is Jake Morrison with Colorado Search and Rescue. We found your son Samuel. He's alive, and he's safe." David dropped the phone and fell to his knees on the stained carpet, sobbing with a mixture of relief and overwhelming guilt that threatened to tear him apart. Samuel was alive, somehow, impossibly, miraculously alive, and David would have to face what he had done. The reunion took place at the base camp medical facility, where Samuel was undergoing evaluation. David approached the building on unsteady legs, his hands shaking so violently he could barely open the door. He had rehearsed 1,000 apologies during the drive up the mountain, but none of them seemed adequate for the magnitude of his betrayal. Samuel was sitting on an examination table, talking calmly with a doctor about his diet and exercise routine during his time alone. He looked up when his father entered, and David saw immediately that this was no longer the frightened 12-year-old he had abandoned. This was someone older, wiser, stronger in ways that defied explanation. "Hello, Dad," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying neither anger nor accusation, just a calm acceptance that stopped David's breath in his throat. David collapsed into a chair beside the examination table, unable to speak through the tears that had been building for months. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the letter he had written during the sleepless hours after Morrison's phone call. His hands trembled as he unfolded the pages, covered with his desperate handwriting. "Samuel, I don't know if you can ever forgive me," David began, reading from the tear-stained paper. "What I did was unforgivable. I was broken by your mother's death, by the bills, by everything falling apart, and I thought I was giving you mercy. I thought I was saving you from watching me destroy our lives." Samuel listened without interruption as his father read the entire letter, a confession that laid bare 4 months of anguish and self-hatred. David described the drinking, the sleepless nights, the daily torture of wondering if his son was still alive. He begged for forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. "I know I have no right to ask for another chance," David finished, his voice breaking completely. "I know I failed you in the worst possible way. But I want you to know that losing you was the worst thing I've ever done, and if there's any way to make it right, I'll spend the rest of my life trying." Samuel reached out and took the letter from his father's hands, studying the handwriting that revealed the depth of David's suffering. The paper was stained with tears and worn from being folded and unfolded countless times, evidence of a man tortured by his own actions. "Dad," Samuel said gently, "I forgave you a long time ago." The words hit David like a physical blow. He looked up at his son through tears, seeing a maturity and wisdom that humbled him completely. This child, whom he had left to die, was offering him the grace he could never have given himself. "I understand why you did it," Samuel continued, his voice steady and calm. "Mom's death broke something in both of us. You thought you were protecting me from more pain. You were wrong, but I understand." David reached out tentatively, and Samuel allowed himself to be pulled into an embrace that neither of them wanted to end. 4 months of guilt and grief and terror poured out of David in sobs that shook his entire body, while Samuel held his father with a strength that came from months of learning to rely on himself. "I'm so proud of what you accomplished," David whispered against Samuel's shoulder. "The cabin, the artwork, everything you did, you're stronger and braver than I ever was." Samuel pulled back to look into his father's eyes. "We're both stronger now, Dad. We both survived things we didn't think we could." The letter in Samuel's hands represented more than an apology. It was evidence of genuine remorse and a commitment to rebuild their relationship on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. David had faced his demons and found the courage to ask for forgiveness, even knowing he might be refused. "What happens now?" David asked, still not daring to hope for a future together. Samuel smiled, and for the first time since his wife's death, David saw genuine happiness in his son's eyes. "Now, we figure out how to be a family again, different than before, but maybe better." The tearful apology letter would become a cherished document in their rebuilt relationship, a reminder of how far they had both traveled from the darkest moments of their lives. The media circus began before Samuel even left the hospital. News vans lined the streets outside the medical facility, reporters shouted questions through the windows, and camera crews jockeyed for position to capture footage of the boy who had captured the world's imagination. Samuel found himself thrust into a spotlight he had never wanted or expected. The first major interview request came from a national morning show, followed quickly by offers from major publishers, documentary filmmakers, and even Hollywood studios interested in turning his story into a movie. The book publishing contract that arrived by overnight courier represented more money than David had seen in his entire life, but it also carried obligations and expectations that worried both father and son. Samuel struggled with the sudden transition from mountain solitude to media celebrity. The constant attention felt overwhelming after months of silence and self-reliance. Reporters asked the same questions repeatedly, often seeming more interested in sensational details than in understanding the deeper aspects of his experience. "How did it feel to be abandoned by your father?" one journalist pressed during an impromptu interview outside a restaurant where Samuel and David had tried to have a quiet dinner. The question hit like a physical blow, undermining the careful healing that was taking place between them. David stepped protectively in front of his son, his face flushed with anger. "We're not discussing that. Samuel has been through enough without having to relive private family matters for your entertainment." The media attention brought unexpected challenges that tested Samuel's newfound maturity. Photographers followed him to school, disrupting classes and making normal social interaction impossible. Classmates treated him like a celebrity rather than a friend, creating an isolation different from, but equally difficult, as his mountain solitude. Samuel found refuge in the woodworking shop that David had set up in their new apartment, a space where he could practice the skills he had developed during his time alone. The familiar feel of tools in his hands and the smell of wood shavings provided comfort and continuity with the life he had built for himself in the wilderness. The publishing contract represented both opportunity and burden. Samuel wanted to share his story in a way that might inspire others facing seemingly impossible challenges, but he also valued his privacy and the quiet relationship he was rebuilding with his father. The advance money would secure their financial future, but it came with promotional obligations that felt overwhelming. Book tour schedules arrived, filled with speaking engagements, television appearances, and media interviews that would consume months of Samuel's life. Publishers wanted to capitalize on the viral nature of his story, while public interest remained high, but Samuel wondered if constant retelling would cheapen the profound personal transformation he had experienced. The documentary crews that requested access to his mountain cabin presented another dilemma. Samuel felt protective of the sanctuary that had saved his life, reluctant to turn it into a tourist attraction or media spectacle. The grove of ancient pines had been his refuge, and part of him wanted to preserve its dignity and solitude. Educational institutions began reaching out with invitations to speak about wilderness survival, self-reliance, and overcoming adversity. These requests felt more meaningful to Samuel than media appearances, offering opportunities to share practical knowledge rather than just sensational stories. Child psychologists and social workers wanted to study Samuel's case, hoping to understand how he had maintained emotional stability during his ordeal and what his experience might teach about human resilience. While Samuel appreciated their scientific interest, he found the clinical approach sometimes missed the spiritual and artistic aspects of his transformation. The attention also brought unwanted contact from people who wanted to exploit his story for their own purposes. Religious groups claimed his survival as evidence of divine intervention. Survivalist organizations wanted to use his techniques to promote their philosophies. Marketing companies offered lucrative endorsement deals for outdoor equipment and survival gear. Samuel learned to navigate these requests with increasing sophistication, developing criteria for determining which opportunities aligned with his values and which were simply attempts to profit from his experience. He began to understand that fame carried responsibilities as well as privileges. The most meaningful responses came from individuals who had been inspired by his story to overcome their own challenges. Letters arrived from people who had survived family trauma, conquered fears, or discovered hidden talents they never knew they possessed. These personal connections reminded Samuel of why sharing his story mattered. David served as Samuel's protector and advisor during this period, helping him make decisions about which opportunities to pursue and which to decline. Their relationship deepened as they worked together to manage the overwhelming response to Samuel's survival story. The book contract sitting on their kitchen table represented more than a publishing deal. It was a symbol of the complex new world they were navigating together, full of opportunities and obligations that would shape their future in ways they were only beginning to understand. 6 months after his rescue, Samuel stood at the same trailhead where his father had left him, but this time they were making the journey together. The hike to his cabin had become a pilgrimage that Samuel needed to complete, a way of showing David the place where his son had been transformed from abandoned child to master craftsman. The trail markers Samuel had created for the rescue team still stood, weathered but intact, guiding them up the mountain path. David read each carved sign with wonder, understanding for the first time the full scope of what his son had accomplished during those 4 months of solitude. "You made all of these?" David asked, running his fingers over the intricate carvings that marked the route to the grove. "I wanted to make sure they could find me when the time came," Samuel replied. "But I also wanted them to understand that I wasn't just surviving up there, I was living." The Colorado Parks and Wildlife Service had officially designated Samuel's cabin as a historical site, recognizing its significance as an example of traditional wilderness survival skills and folk art. A bronze memorial plaque had been installed at the entrance to the grove, its polished surface reflecting the filtered sunlight that fell through the ancient pine canopy. Samuel paused to read the inscription, "Samuel's Cabin, a testament to human resilience." Built by Samuel David Thorne, age 12, during 120 Days of Solitude, March 2024. This structure demonstrates the remarkable capacity of the human spirit to not merely survive, but to create beauty in the face of seemingly impossible challenges. David stood beside his son, reading the plaque with tears in his eyes. The formal recognition of Samuel's achievement helped him understand the magnitude of what had happened here, but it also drove home the reality of what he had put his child through. The cabin itself stood exactly as Samuel had left it, preserved by the dry mountain air and protected by the grove's natural shelter. Park rangers had installed discreet security measures to prevent vandalism while allowing authorized visitors to experience the remarkable structure Samuel had created. Walking through the cabin door felt like stepping back in time for Samuel. Everything was exactly as he had left it, the carved eagle above the fireplace, the hand-woven mats on the floor, the carefully crafted furniture that had made this place a home rather than just a shelter. David moved through the interior spaces with reverence, touching the perfect corner joints, examining the sophisticated toolwork, marveling at the artistic details that transformed functional construction into genuine art. This was where his son had discovered talents neither of them had known existed. "How did you know how to do all this?" David asked, running his hand along the smooth surface of the dining table Samuel had carved from a single massive pine slab. "I remembered Grandpa," Samuel said quietly. "Not consciously at first, but my hands remembered things he taught me when I was little. Being here, needing to create these things, it all came back." The fireplace still contained the ashes of Samuel's last fire, and he knelt beside it now, adding kindling and tinder with the same careful attention he had brought to every aspect of his mountain life. Soon flames danced in the stone hearth, filling the cabin with warmth and the familiar scent of burning pine. Father and son sat together by the fire as evening fell, sharing a quiet that was comfortable rather than strained. David had brought camping gear for an overnight stay, wanting to experience at least a small taste of the life Samuel had built here. "I'm sorry I wasn't here to see you discover all this," David said, gesturing at the remarkable craftsmanship that surrounded them. "I'm sorry I missed watching you become the person you were meant to be." Samuel poked at the fire with a stick he had carved months earlier, its surface worn smooth by countless evenings like this one. "Maybe you needed to be somewhere else, going through your own changes. Maybe we both needed to find our strength separately before we could be strong together." The memorial plaque outside represented more than recognition of Samuel's achievement. It marked this place as a sanctuary where transformation was possible, where human potential could flourish even under the most challenging circumstances. As they prepared for sleep in the cabin where Samuel had spent so many solitary nights, David felt a deep sense of peace settling over him. His son had not just survived the abandonment, he had used it as an opportunity to discover capabilities that might have remained hidden forever under normal circumstances. The bronze plaque would weather and age with time, but the cabin itself would stand as a permanent reminder that resilience and creativity could triumph over abandonment and despair. This place had saved Samuel's life, but more importantly, it had revealed who he truly was. 2 years after his rescue, Samuel stood in his new workshop, surrounded by the tools of his chosen profession. The space was filled with the familiar scent of wood shavings and the quiet satisfaction that came from creating beauty with his hands. Professional woodworking tools lined the walls, gifts from craftsmen around the world who had been inspired by his story and wanted to support his continued artistic development. The workshop had become the heart of their new life together. David had used part of Samuel's book advance to purchase a small property on the outskirts of Boulder, chosen specifically for the large barn that could be converted into a proper woodworking studio. Here, Samuel could practice and refine the skills he had discovered during his mountain ordeal while developing new techniques that pushed his artistry to even greater heights. Samuel's reputation as a craftsman had grown organically from his survival story. The furniture he created combined traditional techniques with innovative approaches that reflected his unique perspective on the relationship between human creativity and natural materials. His pieces were sought after by collectors who appreciated both their technical excellence and their connection to his remarkable journey. The speaking engagements had evolved from media appearances into something more meaningful. Samuel now traveled to schools, youth programs, and wilderness education centers, sharing not just his survival techniques but the deeper lessons about resilience, self-discovery, and the importance of finding creative expression even in difficult circumstances. His presentations always included live demonstrations of woodworking techniques, showing young people how to create beauty from simple materials. Samuel had learned that hands-on experience was more powerful than any lecture about overcoming challenges. When children felt wood respond to their touch, when they successfully completed their first carved project, they discovered their own capacity for achievement that went far beyond survival skills. The wilderness education programs Samuel helped develop had become models for outdoor learning centers around the country. These programs emphasized not just survival techniques, but the artistic and spiritual dimensions of connecting with natural environments. Students learned to see the wilderness as a partner in their development rather than an adversary to be conquered. David had found his own path to healing through supporting Samuel's work. He managed the business aspects of his son's speaking career, handled correspondence with schools and organizations, and helped design curricula that incorporated Samuel's insights about resilience and creativity. Their working partnership had deepened their personal relationship in ways that pure family time alone could never have achieved. The book Samuel had written about his experience had become required reading in many outdoor education programs and was frequently assigned in psychology courses studying human adaptation and resilience. But Samuel was prouder of the letters he received from young people who had been inspired to pursue their own creative interests or to persist through difficult family situations. The documentary about his survival had won several awards and had been translated into dozens of languages, carrying his message of hope and self-reliance to audiences around the world. More importantly, it had sparked conversations about alternative approaches to education that emphasized practical skills and creative problem-solving over standardized testing and passive learning. Samuel's cabin in the mountains had become a destination for researchers studying traditional building techniques and sustainable living practices. The structure continued to weather mountain storms and seasonal changes, proving the soundness of the construction methods he had developed through necessity and intuition. Educational groups made regular pilgrimages to the preserved cabin, where park rangers used Samuel's story to teach lessons about wilderness survival, environmental harmony, and the human capacity for adaptation. The site had become a symbol of hope for anyone facing seemingly impossible challenges. The relationship between Samuel and his father had evolved into something stronger than their original family bond. They had both been tested by tragedy and separation, and both had discovered inner resources they hadn't known they possessed. Their mutual respect was based on shared experience of overcoming adversity rather than simple biological connection. Samuel's workshop tools represented more than implements for creating furniture and art. They were symbols of a life rebuilt on a foundation of self-knowledge and creative expression. Each tool had been selected for its quality and potential, just as Samuel had learned to select materials and opportunities based on their capacity to contribute to something larger than immediate survival. The young man who worked in this shop bore little resemblance to the frightened 12-year-old who had been abandoned on a mountain trail. Samuel had discovered that survival was only the beginning of human potential. The real achievement was learning to create meaning, beauty, and connection, even when circumstances seemed designed to destroy hope. As evening light filtered through the workshop windows, Samuel put down his carving tools and stepped back to examine the day's work. Tomorrow he would continue shaping wood into forms that served both practical and artistic purposes, continuing the journey of discovery that had begun in a grove of ancient pines and would last for the rest of his life.